So I want to welcome everyone to our fireside chat, followed by a panel, Diverging Paths for Platform Liability, the Impact of Section 230, and the Choice for America's Future, which is a very catchy title. I'm Ben Brody. I cover tech lobbying and policy at Bloomberg News here in Washington. I'm really excited for what we have got set up for you guys. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is a nearly 25-year-old US law that almost certainly underlies whatever you think is the best part of the internet. For many people, that's sharing memes about the Marvel Universe, networking with employers, or procuring that last salad fork to complete grandma's silver. But for others, the internet means sharing memes about white supremacy, networking with fellow anti-vaxxers, or procuring illegal drugs, or even human beings. The internet is in absolutely every single aspect of our lives, and whether you want to start a freedom movement or spread a hostile foreign power's misinformation, Section 230 has likely made that easier and faster than ever before imaginable. Not surprisingly, a lot of powerful people want to change it, and at least one recent effort, last year's passage of FOSTA SESTA, to limit the shield when it comes to sex trafficking, have been successful. That's what we're going to discuss today. To my left is Jeff Kosseff. He's a professor of cybersecurity law at the United States Naval Academy, the author of The 26 Words That Created the Internet, a history of Section 230 that came out in April. Practiced law at Covington and Burling, before which he clerked in the Eastern District of Virginia and on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. In a former life, he was a journalist, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and a recipient of the George Polk Award for National Reporting. So Jeff, I want to hand it off to you to get us all on the same level for this conversation. What does Section 230 do, and how did it come about? And I'm going to hand this off to you.
Okay, well, thanks so much for having me here. Before I start, I just have to give the disclaimer that everything I say today is only on my own behalf, not the Naval Academy, Navy, DoD, and after you hear how opinionated I am, you'll probably understand why I have to specifically say that. So Section 230 really, and I can say this having shopped around a book proposal in 2015 and 2016, a lot of people hadn't heard about Section 230 at that time. Some publishers said, you know, what on earth is this? What is intermediary liability? I found a publisher, Cornell Press, that actually did see this as being odd enough and obscure enough that it could make an interesting book, and I'm very thankful to them. But I would say the timing was pretty fortuitous for being published this year, because now it actually is in the news. And what I like to do in a lot of these talks is to explain how it came about, because we're looking at a lot of potential changes to Section 230, and we're giving it a much needed evaluation as to how effective it is. But I don't think it's possible to really evaluate Section 230 without understanding why we even have it. So I'm going to take us way back, and I apologize for those who have been at previous talks I've given. This might seem a little redundant, but I do think it's important to go back to understand why Congress passed Section 230. And to do that, you have to go way before the modern internet was developed, and you go back to the 1950s. And there were prosecutions increasing for obscenity. And obscenity back then was defined very differently by the Supreme Court and by state legislatures and local governments than it is now. There was a much broader conception of what's obscene and therefore not protected by the First Amendment. So you started having local governments, state governments pass obscenity ordinances. And parts of these ordinances said, if you're a bookstore or a newsstand, you can be criminally liable if you sell obscene material. And they varied in terms of their wording. Where this really came into affecting Section 230 was a case in the late 50s involving a 72-year-old immigrant from Poland named Eliezer Smith. He owned a newsstand in a pretty seedy part of downtown Los Angeles, and he sold a lot of books. He sold thousands of books. One of them was called Sweeter Than Life, which was I actually have a copy at home. I did not bring it with me. It's not a very good book. It's not a very well-written book, and it's basically the plot is what you might see after 10 p.m. on broadcast TV today. But unfortunately for Mr. Smith, the LAPD Vice Squad that went into his bookstore thought that it was not just tacky, but it was obscene. So he is brought up on charges of violating LA's obscenity ordinance, and he is convicted, sentenced to 30 days in jail, and he gets a really good pro bono First Amendment attorney, Stanley Fleischman, who appeals all the way to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court says is, okay, it doesn't matter whether this book is obscene. What matters is that this LA ordinance holds a bookseller criminally liable for selling the speech of someone else without any regard to whether he knew or had reason to know of the contents. And the Supreme Court said there's no way he could have reviewed thousands and thousands of books and magazines, so we're going to strike this down. So the rule from that case going forward was the First Amendment prohibits holding the distributor of someone else's content liable unless they knew or had reason to know, and there are some different variations that I won't go into today. And that worked really well for the next 30 years in a lot of different cases, not just involving criminal liability, but also selling materials that are defamatory. Where it started to fall apart a little bit was in the early 90s. You started to have these services connecting people online. Services, when I teach this to my students, they have no idea what I'm talking about. CompuServe and Prodigy were the two main ones, and they had very different business models. So CompuServe basically did not moderate any user content. CompuServe said, you could post whatever you want. They let newsletters post whatever they want. And Prodigy wanted to distinguish itself. So Prodigy said, we're going to be family friendly. So we're going to hire moderators, have user content policies. And so that's what they did. They moderated a lot of content, not everything, but they had some policies. And they both end up getting sued for defamation arising from third-party content. So one of the case against CompuServe ends up getting dismissed because what the judge says is CompuServe is just like a newsstand. It doesn't edit content. There was no reason for it to know of what was in this newsletter that was posted on its services. Prodigy, on the other hand, they ended up getting sued over a comment on a financial bulletin board posted about actually the guy who Jonah Hill played in The Wolf of Wall Street, who ended up pleading guilty to fraud crimes, and the posting said he had committed fraud, but this was a different fraud, so he sued for defamation. And what the judge said is Prodigy does not get the same protections as CompuServe because it exercises editorial control. So Prodigy is held to strict liability for any defamatory content, just like a newspaper would for a letter to the editor. So that was in '95, and that caught the attention of Congress because at the time Congress was debating the Telecom Act, which would become the Telecom Act of '96, and most of the focus was on things like local phone competition and long distance rates and things that really seemed important at the time, and nobody was really focusing on online platforms at the time, understandably. But there were a few members who were. A Republican from California, Chris Cox, and a Democrat from Portland, both at the time in the House, Ron Wyden, they realized the Stratton-Oakmont decision didn't make sense for a few reasons. First, that it could really discourage investment in these online platforms, which really seemed to have potential for new industries. And the other reason is that it actually created this perverse incentive that discouraged the platforms from moderating content. At the time, there was this real sort of fear about, at the time, I think the term was cyber pornography. There was a cover story in Time magazine, really terrifying image of a kid at a computer lighting up his face, and it said cyber pornography. So there were people who were really concerned about it. In the Senate, they actually proposed the Communications Decency Act, which included a lot of prohibitions of the transmission of indecent materials online. But Cox and Wyden wanted to do something different. So they created what would become Section 230, which basically says that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. That's the first part.
Can you repeat
No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So that's 26 words, hence the title of my book. But then there's a second part, which basically says if they exercise good faith efforts to moderate lewd, lascivious, or otherwise objectionable content, they can't be held liable for that. So that reflects these two goals of basically promoting innovation online, but also promoting the ability to moderate. And I will say there was very little public attention to this. It was proposed, it was added to the House version of the Telecom Act, and I think there were 4 members who voted against it. There was no statement on the floor against it. I think partly because a lot of members didn't quite understand the internet at the time, as evident from some of the comments that they made on the floor about the Telecom Act. But that gets into the House version. The Senate Communications Decency Act gets into the Senate version, and then in conference, they basically put both the Senate and House versions, Section 230 and the Communications Decency Act, into the final Telecom Act. And again, very little coverage. The little coverage that was given to the issue was about the decency part, because civil liberties groups were very concerned about it. The day that President Clinton signed it into law in '96, there was a legal challenge by civil liberties groups, and the Supreme Court would then repeal the Communications Decency Act part of it. So all you have left is Section 230. And from there, it's still, nobody quite knew. Yeah, so the way that courts have interpreted that, to say that you can't treat an interactive computer service as the publisher or speaker has been pretty broad. And I will mention, because there's been a little confusion, there are a few exceptions in Section 230. The 2 most notable ones are for federal criminal law and for intellectual property law. So one myth that comes out a lot recently is that Section 230 allows piracy. That's just not true. There are concerns about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which has a safe harbor program, but Section 230 has always had an intellectual property exception and federal criminal law. But what the courts have basically said, they've had a fairly broad reading. So if a platform is sued for defamatory comments that its users post, even if the platform has gotten a notice about it or has reason to know, they're going to be immune under Section 230. There's been some abrogation, which I go into in the book, and the courts have been not the clearest as to when the platform actually contributes to the content. They've had something called a material contribution test, and we could talk later about some of these cases. But overall, it's been a fairly broad reading of the immunity, and that's the cases, I would say, the cases always have been difficult. There have been some really tough cases where people have had very awful things happen to them, and for whatever reason they can't or they don't sue the person who posted the content, and then Section 230 prevents them from suing the actual platform. So that's where some of the source of the criticism has been. I would say the other source of the criticism, which has been more recent, has been that the platforms are moderating too much. So we have one side saying they're not moderating enough, they're not blocking harmful content. Yeah.
And say briefly, what is moderation? And then make that point about too much of it.
So moderation could be either human or machine-based, but basically block, and it could be a lot of different things. It could either be blocking before the fact or after the fact harmful content that violates their standards or their policies, if the platform has a policy. So something like hate speech. How do we define hate speech? Or advocating violence, things like that. Section 230 gives the platforms the ability to set these policies. And I think based on at least my interviews with the people who were involved in shaping Section 230, that was kind of the point. There's this idea of user empowerment, that the users will demand certain practices and certain policies from their platforms, and if they don't get that, they'll walk away. So it's going to be a market-based solution.
And you talked about moderating a little bit, not enough, and then moderating a little bit too much.
Yeah, and I think there are, and again, this is just my opinion, I think of the two criticisms, I would say that And again, I don't want to say platforms. I hate saying that because there's actually more than 3 platforms. It's not just Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. They're actually, I would say a lot of the mid-sized platforms have been even more thoughtful in terms of their practices. But I would say probably they're, at least for some platforms, they've not moderated enough bad content, or they also haven't been transparent enough. I mean, I work at the Naval Academy, so I interact with intelligence agencies, and I would say that in some cases, the platforms are about as secretive as the intelligence agencies are in terms of how they're explaining their moderation practices. And I would say that really has to change, because this is, if they don't do a better job of that, this is an existential threat to a lot of them if Section 230 is repealed.
I think that's actually a good cue to bring our panel up. While they're coming up, if anybody has any questions for Jeff while we kind of organize the chairs. What Section 230 is, what it does? Gentlemen?
What do you make of the increasing, I guess, product liability run around 230, in which suits will target not user speech per se, but the provision of some feature that allows like Snapchat speed filter or the Army speeds?
Yeah, so I think these are tougher cases, and I'm also, I would say, I'm a little more mixed on those cases because I think that they increase the chances of something really bad happening to Section 230. And I think the core of Section 230, the core speech cases, end up getting threatened if you have these examples of sort of product liability cases. So I think it really, there are good arguments on both sides on those, and it really depends on how broadly you're going to read the Section 230 immunity.
I don't have a mic. All right. I want to introduce our panel. So to my immediate right is, I have to find your bio, is Llansó. She is the director of the Center for Democracy and Technology's Free Expression Project, which works to promote law and policy that support users' free expression rights in the United States and around the world. You already met Jeff. To his right is Billy Easley. He's the senior policy analyst for Americans for Prosperity for Technology, Free Speech, and Criminal Justice Policy. He reviews state and federal policies on digital, free speech, privacy, and government surveillance. And finally, Dr. Jessica Ashooh. She is the director of policy for Reddit, overseeing all content, product, advertising, and public policy for the company, as well as for global government relations. And Ryan, I'm so sorry that I skipped you. Ryan Hagemann, who I looked over, is a technology policy executive for IBM. His policy expertise focuses on regulatory governance of emerging technologies and other issues at the intersection of technology, regulation, and the digital economy. Ryan, I'm actually glad I landed on you because I want to start. So Jeff brought you through the beginning of the debate. Ryan, on July 10th, posted a blog post with IBM that frames kind of where we're at right now. So I want to start with him, ask him to explain a little bit about this, and then have folks jump in. Ryan wrote, instead of holding all online platforms exempt from liability by default, IBM believes that the exemption should be conditioned on companies applying a standard of, quote, reasonable care and taking actions and preventative measures to curb unlawful uses of their service. They say it would provide a strong incentive for companies to limit illegal and illicit behavior online, while also being flexible enough to promote continued online innovation and fairly easy adaptation to different online business models. It does not mean eliminating entirely the intermediary liability protections of the Communications Decency Act Section 230 or comparable laws in Europe, nor does it call for amending the Good Samaritan provision, but it believes that companies should be held legally responsible to use reasonable, common sense care when it comes to moderating online content. So Ryan, why do you think that it's time to embrace an alternative model? And is this just a way for a cloud provider to strike back at some competitors that do host third-party content?
Well, thanks, Ben. Thanks to IGF and also to CSIS for hosting us here. I don't see why I should have to go first because you skipped over me. That seems like you're actually adding additional cost to me. So, yeah, I won't go through too much of the history of what's happened over the last few years in the tech ecosystem space, because I think there's a lot more people up here who have been much more engaged in this debate, and I think they're in a better position to go over that. So instead, I'll just start with why IBM came out with this position, and I will address your question with regards to whether or not this is just us trying to get the better of our competitors, quote unquote. Fast forward, it's not. So this is not an idea. The reasonable care standard that Ben read off to you is not actually an idea that gestated with IBM. This is an idea that was originally floated, I believe, back in 2017 by Professor Danielle Citron, who's now at Boston University Law School, and Ben Wittes, who I'm sure for the DC folks in the room needs no introduction, but editor of Lawfare blog. And this largely built off a lot of the work that Professor Citron had done on kind of cyberbullying and hate crimes online. So there was a free speech angle to it. IBM decided to embrace this perspective because we are actually looking at this through the lens of strictly illegal content online. And I'd like to explain a little bit why it is we decided to jump into this debate. So over the last 2 years or so, basically since Professor Citron and Mr. Wittes wrote this article, as we're all aware, there's been a developing techlash. A lot of this vitriol and a lot of this rhetoric has been aimed at the consumer-facing digital platforms, but some of the companies that have been essentially turned into collateral damage in this fight are not in that position in the digital ecosystem. So as Ben said, IBM is primarily a cloud hosting and storage provider. So most of our business is business to business and contracts for hosting content that is not readily accessible to the public. Nonetheless, over the last year and a half, we've seen the proliferation of a lot of rules, regulation, and legislation around the world because IBM is active in over 175 countries around the world, in which there is no distinction being made between consumer-facing platforms that actually have the technical capability to do more targeted content moderation and removal, and companies that are further down the infrastructure stack in the digital economy. So I won't name any particular pieces of legislation, but ISPs as well as cloud storage providers are increasingly getting roped up into this debate, whether we like it or not. And one of our concerns, and the reason that we've sort of advanced this policy proposal, is as we've seen the 230 debate in the United States of the last few years, there hasn't been much of a development. And so what has been lacking is a compromise-oriented middle here. There is a very strong voice in support of not changing 230, and there is a very strong voice supporting it as kind of the law that created the internet, as I think Jeff coined. But there really isn't a voice talking about what specific changes to 230 should occur, what specific amendments we should be making looking forward. And our concern is moving forward that legislators may not view the distinction between the different levels of the digital economy with the same kind of care that other people would, people in think tank world, people like Jeff who think about this issue very seriously and very thoughtfully. So our goal here is primarily to open up the space in that moderate middle to try to achieve some sort of compromise so that we don't see some of the rush to knee-jerk reactionary proposals that we've seen in other quarters in the world.
So I appreciate that people are trying to figure out. Oh goodness, is it? Does that work? Okay. I appreciate that we're trying to find a way to move forward, but I have the same problem with IBM's reasonable care proposal that I had with Ben Wittes' proposal in regards to Bad Samaritans and trying to figure out when they should determine when courts should intervene and not allow a liability shield. And that specifically is the concern about there not being any sort of real bright line rule about application in this scenario, right? I mean, I think it's easy for us to look at people like Backpage or The Dirty or any number of websites that we can look at and say, okay, you guys are clearly hosting illegal illegal issues, and you're not really engaging in any sort of moderation, and you're and therefore maybe you're just truly a bad actor. But that's the easy positions, I think. I think the harder ones will be when someone says, okay, Facebook did not take down this information within 30 days or within 10 days, whatever your number will be. Therefore, they're not being responsible actors. They're not showing reasonable care. So I don't think it's a strong enough rule to really create stability in terms of moderation. But I appreciate you trying to come up with something. I still don't think it hits the mark. That's just my personal view.
Yeah, and on the kind of question about having discussions about different alternatives, one thing I'd really recommend. How's that? Yes. Great. Okay. So one thing I'd recommend for anyone in the US thinking about Section 230 and alternative models for intermediary liability is to take a close look at the conversations that are happening outside of the US. There are a lot of debates happening in Europe, in countries around the world about their intermediary liability regimes, which already start from a sort of a less strong, a less sort of blanket approach than we have in the US. And I think a lot of those discussions point to some of the challenges with like a reasonable care standard. We've seen that proposed by countries like the United Kingdom very recently in a proceeding around online harms, and there was a lot of feedback to the initial proposal about kind of crafting a duty of care around all sorts of different kinds of content, both illegal and lawful speech. I think that's always going to be one of the fundamental challenges in saying, you know, we want a reasonable care standard focused strictly on illegal speech, so that, you know, content online is sort of, it's when something gets uploaded, it's Schrodinger's content. It might be illegal, it might be lawful, and the intermediary is not going to be able to tell that from, you know, just from the moment of upload. Everything from, you know, the actual nature of the content to the context, the speaker, who is involved in posting this content are going to matter when determining, is this illegal content that we're talking about? So if you want to try to narrow what a reasonable care standard is to focus just on illegal content, you're already sort of presupposing evaluation of all of the content on the platform, which has notable risks of overbroad impact. That's where free expression concerns with this kind of idea come into play, that in order for intermediaries to demonstrate that they're meeting some sort of reasonableness standard required by law, they will be overcautious. They will restrict much more than what is actually, as would be determined by a judge, illegal. I don't think I can turn those on. But it's a sunny day. Let's just keep going. Here we go. Somebody moved. That's good.
Jessica, what would a reasonable care standard look like for Reddit? How would it change what you do day to day?
Well, I actually want to back it up and take it to a higher level, because I think a lot of the conversation when we talk about amendments to CDA 230 really focuses on one type of internet company and one model of content moderation. The conversation is always dealing with, you know, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and all of those companies are very large, and they all moderate centrally with, you know, sometimes tens of thousands of employees in Facebook's case. Reddit operates quite differently. Some of you may not be familiar with how Reddit is structured, but you can think of Reddit as a series of message boards that are organized around interest. All of those message boards are user created and user moderated. So content policy on Reddit really has two levels, and you can think of it as a federal system. So on the top level, we have, you know, if you want to think of it as our constitution, we've got our content policy, which I and my team set from the top. It's a corporate set policy. It's very high level. It includes things like don't incite, encourage, or glorify violence. Don't harass people. Don't sell controlled goods on the platform. Don't share what we call involuntary pornography. These types of things that we can all generally agree upon. But beyond that, our user moderators, who are not employees of ours, and in fact, they're anonymous to us because we have a different model in terms of privacy. We don't collect a lot of user data. We don't collect your real name or anything like that. So these user moderators are free and in fact encouraged by us to set their own much more specific rules for their little slice of the website that are appropriate to their community. So for example, we have, it's a silly community, but it illustrates the point. We have a community called Cats Standing Up. And in Cats Standing Up, you may only post a photo of a cat standing up on 2 legs, not 4 legs, 2 legs. And you must, the only thing that you can comment or write in this subreddit is the word cat, period. If you write anything else other than the word cat, period, it will be removed by the moderators. And we provide those moderators with some automated tools to help them in this endeavor. And that's within their prerogative. It's a little bit silly, but a more serious example is we have a lot of subreddits that deal with news. So we have a large news community, r/news, and they've had to think very thoughtfully about how they want to deal with, say, the fake news issue. So they've decided amongst themselves, again, without any type of our company involvement, that they want to operate based on a whitelist of news sources that they consider trustworthy. And it works very well for that community. So again, with the automated moderation tools that we give them, they can automatically remove any URLs that come from a site that they do not consider a trusted news source. You can imagine what a disaster it would be in terms of outcry if we, at the corporate level, tried to set a policy saying we think this is a legitimate news source, this isn't. But we let the communities figure it out for themselves, and it works. And if a user doesn't agree with the policy of a particular subreddit, they're absolutely free to go and start their own subreddit with their own rules and their own source whitelist if they would like to do so. And it's hard to envision a user-led moderator system being in the marketplace at all without CDA 230. If we were held liable for everything that the users potentially posted, we wouldn't be able to have this model. We fundamentally would not be able to exist. And that's where this becomes a competitive issue, because at a time when we're talking about antitrust investigations and we're wondering if the biggest players are too big, the last thing you want to do is make a law that makes it harder for smaller companies like mine to compete, or even makes it impossible for smaller companies like mine to exist.
Jeff, I was wondering if you could maybe take us through some of the political realities of a site like Reddit, and I want Jessica to be able to answer this as well, but maybe we can start with you, of a site that has been criticized as a place that has white nationalism, other kinds of objectionable content, and has been a convening forum for some of the worst impulses in our society. So maybe if we can start with Jeff, but I want you to be able to answer that as well.
Yeah, so that's where the sort of 2 separate types of criticism of Section 230, I think, make the debate very difficult. So we have the criticism that I think Speaker Pelosi and I think a lot of Democrats have raised, that there's not enough moderation. Now, Speaker Pelosi had a video posted of her that was edited to make it look like she was incapacitated, and it wasn't some would argue it wasn't properly dealt with and that it stayed up. So that's one set of arguments. The other set, which is coming from some conservative members of Congress and conservative groups, is that there's too much moderation and that there's not, I guess the term they would use is neutrality, and that their argument is that Section 230 requires neutrality or is premised on neutrality. One of the reasons I think the history is important is because it's actually premised on not having neutrality, on giving the platforms the tools to be able to have that breathing room to decide what is proper. And I think what you're talking about with some of these sort of fringe speech, some people, I think there are some things that are clearly bad, and some, I mean, there's illegal, there's criminal content, for example. But when you're talking about some sort of political speech, there could be things that some might argue is hate speech or could incite violence, while others might say, no, that's legitimate political speech. And that's why it's so difficult. And that's why Section 230 is so important, because it gives the platforms the ability to make those really tough decisions. And we're not talking about like 3 or 4 decisions a day. We're talking about just this vast amount of content that's coming in all the time. And that's where I see the real challenge, is distinguishing between that. And I don't think there's an easy way to do it, but I think you'd probably know better than I do.
Yeah, I think that your question gets again to the diversity that exists amongst companies in the industry and what is the life of a startup. So when you have companies that are just starting out in this space, they're small startups, content moderation is generally not the first thing that the kid in the garage in Silicon Valley thinks of, for better or for worse. They think about how to actually get the site functioning and get a product up to marketplace. And so I think in terms of Reddit's evolution, one of our corporate values that we have is evolve. And you see that very much in terms of our content moderation. And if anyone has been following the history of Reddit, yes, in the past there have been some spicy, controversial things on the website, to put it mildly. But that was at a time when the company was no more than 60 people and several 100 million users. So that was a capacity issue that was to be expected. Since I've come to Reddit, so I'm the first policy director that the company has ever had, because again, it's startup land. Like, the policy director is not the first person that you hire. But since then, we've been going through our rules very methodically and making sure that they're up to date and adequate for what the world and the internet is like today. So again, anyone who follows Reddit will have noticed that we've made several updates to our rules. We've taken down some notorious content that I think was good and made the site better and made it better for our primary users. But I think the other thing that's really important about this debate is it's often talked about in very binary terms. You either leave the content up, you take the content down. There are a lot of kind of other things that you can do. So for example, we have a quarantine feature on Reddit that kind of gets to some of the things that Jeff was talking about, where the speech to most people will, kind of to the average person, will be highly offensive, but it doesn't technically break our rules, and it's one of those things where it would be perhaps a slippery slope to take it down. So we have a quarantine feature that allows us to put that content behind a warning screen and to include on that warning screen resources that might redirect people towards better, more authoritative content. For example, in the case of anti-vax stuff, we can refer them to the CDC's vaccination page, or for content that might be considered borderline hateful, we can refer them to groups that help people leave hateful groups. And it drops, and this function will also drop that content out of user recommendations and things of that nature, so that we're not, with the product, pushing people further into content that may be unhealthy. And I think, yet, we're not making people victims. We're not creating martyrs out of people who might have borderline beliefs. And so for us, that's been a good balance. And I think that it's important to allow companies to have those types of tailor-made solutions, because again, under 230, without 230, it's either leave it up, take it down. There's no in between.
So Emma, in a world where a company policy can really, I think, change the speech tenor of a site like Reddit, why not create incentives in the law to develop those kinds of policies?
Well, part of the question is, like, what sort of incentive are you creating? One argument about Section 230 is that it actually creates the incentive for exactly this sort of activity by removing the legal risk that your users will sue you for taking down their lawful speech, or for whatever you happen to do with moderating content. So, in the sort of the null state without Section 230, there is some risk involved for website operators, for platforms, for doing content moderation. And Section 230 actually helps make it clear that they can do what is also arguably their First Amendment ability to set their own policies and help kind of interact with and create and shape communities on their platform. One of the big challenges of a law sort of strongly incentivizing this sort of content moderation is that it would be a law encouraging companies to restrict people's constitutionally protected speech. And that's going to have major First Amendment problems. And that's sort of a theme I think you will see in any of the debates about what the future of Section 230 would be, that we can and should debate and discuss what a different model might look like. But especially here in the US, we will always have to contend with the First Amendment and the really strong limitations that it puts on government efforts to set up regulatory frameworks that could restrict speech.
I want to follow up on that because I think that's a really important point here, because every single framework, even the ones that I think are the most thoughtful and the most targeted to get at the worst kinds of speech, are just clearly have a First Amendment issue that the person tries to work around but doesn't successfully do it, in my opinion. I don't like picking on people, but like, I thought Senator Hawley's bill was a perfect example of this, right? Like, one of the issues with that was specifically saying that, all right, any...
What is Senator Hawley's bill?
Oh, I'm sorry about this. Senator Hawley, Josh Hawley of Missouri, came out with legislation, I think it was last month, that specifically tried to deal with this concern about political bias against conservatives on social media generally. And basically, the framework of the legislation was, all right, look, if you want Section 230 protection, you need to go to the Federal Trade Commission. You need to be able to get certified by the commission that you have not engaged in, that you've acted neutrally towards political speech. And you'll get that certification for 2 years, and then you'll have to reapply. Bad for one regulatory reason, which is if you have to worry about this every 2 years, and how can you have a business model that you can consistently think will still stick around for that period of time. And then the other legal issue was when you went into the definitions of what does it mean to act in a neutral manner. It means that you can't have taken down speech based on its speech that was targeting a political candidate or a political statement or a political issue, and there really wasn't any trying to kind of argument from either Senator Hawley or within the legislation itself to try to grapple with, well, what does it mean? How do you determine whether this speech is of a political nature, right? I mean, there might be some speech that I look at that I think is just a standard conversation starter that actually is political in another person's view, and the Federal Trade Commission would be the one that would have to determine that. So there's no regulatory sort of framework or stability in that kind of analysis. So not only do you have to deal with that sort of FTC trying to figure this issue out, but then you'd have to deal with the First Amendment issue about, well, is this the kind of speech that we can take down? So I'm not sure exactly. They don't pay me enough to figure out the best way, the best kind of framework to fix this. But I think every serious sort of debate about this has to deal with the First Amendment issue first before we can even get into the framework of what's going to be the right standard.
Ryan, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, since we are having the debates that Billy talked about, and a lot of us have alluded to, what is the political reality of acknowledging that we're having the debate and talking about what should be preserved versus kind of lining up on your side and saying we should change it, we should?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start by saying that IBM doesn't take any position on the free speech issue here. We don't touch the political bias stuff. We're specifically focused on clearly illegal content. So yes, we're not going for the gray areas. We're not going for the edge cases. We're going for things like opioid sales, child pornography, sex trafficking, and other clearly illegal activity. To Billy's point regarding the need to sort of condition any sort of broader conversation around what kind of standard we may or may not want to set in terms of amending CDA 230 on the need to address the free speech issue first. I think if that's a condition on the debate, then we will never actually move beyond that point. I mean, we can debate what is and is not acceptable speech all day long, and indeed people have done it for all of history. And I think the political reality right now is there will be changes to Section 230, almost certainly. It may not be next month, it may not be before the end of this year. I will tell you right now, if I was a betting man, which I am not for the record, but if I was, I would put there being a much higher likelihood of us seeing some sort of content regulation or Section 230 amendment bill passing the Senate, at the very least, before any privacy legislation did this year. That would be my guess, because this issue has riled up a lot of people. And maybe some of it's understandable and maybe some of it not so much. But the reality that we're dealing with is there is movement and there is traction on this. So the question right now, from my perspective, is not shall we amend 230? The question is how shall we amendment? And who are the thoughtful people and the thoughtful organizations and the individuals who are going to be at the table to say, here's what we propose. And so that's why IBM did what we did. This is our proposal. This is what we view as sort of a starting point for a broader conversation with people who actually want to engage in this debate beyond simply throwing rhetorical barbs at each other.
Does everyone agree with that? 230 before privacy?
I don't. I think that we have a working group on data privacy that's been working for like the last 6 months on this. I think for sure data privacy will happen before 230. I disagree with that. But I've been wrong before, so that's just my view of the current makeup and priorities that people on the tech side in the Senate and in the House, based on talking with them, that's my view. I think 230, I think there's a lot of competing people in regards to what they want from 230, and I think that's slowing down the discussion. But I think I do think that what we are seeing is if it's not a full amendment in terms of a new standard, I think what we definitely are seeing is people wanting specific carve-outs, right? I mean, similar to the FOSTA-SESTA thing. It's totally possible we might see that. I'll amend my statement to that issue, but I don't think we're going to see a wholesale sort of change to 230 beyond that.
Sure. I mean, I just want to clarify. You're talking about only removing protections for content that's very clearly illegal, but CDA 230 doesn't give liability protection against content that is federally illegal. And we saw this, unfortunately, in the whole SESTA-FOSTA debacle, which was all about getting Backpage, which was doing terrible things, and they should go to jail. And they probably will. But, the Justice Department, child sex trafficking was already illegal. The Justice Department absolutely had the authority to go after Backpage. They didn't need a new law to do so. And that was very clearly demonstrated by the fact that I think like the day before SESTA was actually signed into law, they finally seized the website. And yet the law passed, and it had real consequences that, again, I can talk to from a platform perspective. And give a concrete example. We had a harm reduction community for sex workers that we were aware of. And we had looked at it, and as far as we could tell, it was all people who were voluntarily in the industry, and they were sharing harm reduction tips with each other about how to stay healthy, how to stay safe, sharing resources about where to go if they got in trouble. It seemed like nothing untoward was going on in terms of the law, yet nonetheless, SESTA and FOSTA passed, and so we were aware of it, and there would have been emails and records showing that we were aware of it, and so we showed it to our legal department, and they said, it's got to come down. And I know that, with certain elements of the political spectrum, sex workers are not the most sympathetic group of people, but you can imagine if another carve-out were to happen around something like, say, opioids. We have a lot of harm reduction communities that talk about drug use, or discussion communities for people who are struggling with addiction. And following the same logic, we may have to take those down. And that seems like it's bad for the people who are struggling with these problems, who the law is intending to protect.
And just to chime in that there is actually an active First Amendment challenge to SESTA-FOSTA that was brought by the Woodhull Foundation, Human Rights Watch, the Internet Archive, and Electronic Frontier Foundation, representing a few individuals who were experiencing exactly this sort of restriction on their ability to do entirely lawful activity online, whether it was information for sex workers on how to keep themselves safe and healthy, or a man who's a licensed massage therapist who ran his his business through Craigslist and could no longer access that entire forum when Craigslist responded to the passage of Sesta Fosta by shutting down their entire category for adult services that non-sexual massages also fell under. So I think it's really important to recognize that in the what we sort of learned from the Sesta Fosta debate, which was that there was pre-existing federal criminal law that prosecutors could and did use to prosecute Backpage.com, and the law that was passed has some serious constitutional deficiencies that are being looked at by a court right now. I don't believe anybody has actually used the FOSTA law yet, either at the state or federal level, but we have seen a number of different reports from sex worker communities around the world about the kind of the harm and the impact to their communities, including in places where sex work is lawful because of the kind of loss of online spaces that they faced.
Jeff, do you want to bring us into the international context, how content regulation is thought about internationally and how that's changed even in the last year?
Yeah, so I think Emma is probably better equipped to talk about some of the more current issues, but I'll say overall, I mean, we don't have anything in other countries that's the same as Section 230. We have other countries that have basically the U.S. pre-Section 230 rules to different extents. We have some that are much stricter, depending on which country you're in, but even in some sort of Western democracies, you have hate speech laws, you have definitely notice and takedown. So it's very, the U.S. is really exceptional in regards to having Section 230, and I think it's not just a coincidence that a lot of the large platforms originated for social media and user speech originated in the United States, because I think Section 230 gave them the space to be able to do that.
Emma, did you want to speak to the
Oh, sure. Trends we're seeing in, so I focus in particular on the trends in Europe. And one of the things that we've seen as the European Union looks at online content issues is a trend towards, one, wanting to mandate filtering. So to kind of mandate that companies sort of try to preemptively or proactively remove what might be illegal content, which raises a number of concerns because many different types of filtering are notoriously overbroad. And there's also a real focus around kind of timeframes and wanting companies to take content down, within very short timeframes of being notified about it, which again, it often comes up in the context of concerns about terrorist propaganda in particular, or hate speech or maybe incitement to violence. And it's from the kind of the public policy side, understandable to think like, okay, a quick response is really warranted. And if you see content that is proposing an imminent attack, yes, that is the sort of thing that seems like a quick response is really warranted. But to sort of treat all content that might be, even just kind of generic propaganda about, a terrorist organization or, or a hateful ideal, to say that there's a kind of a rational reason why that needs to come down in 24 hours or 8 hours, or even the latest in the terrorist content regulation in Europe is a 1 hour removal time period. It absolutely tilts the balance completely on the side of rapid takedown without evaluation, really of the content or the context in which it's posted, or any kind of consideration of, is there some legitimate reason that this person is sharing this material that maybe isn't immediately apparent on its face. So it really tilts the scales in the side of takedown without question, as opposed to giving intermediaries the breathing room to have emergency responses in circumstances where an emergency is clearly evident, but also to be thoughtful about things like videos documenting war crimes in Syria, where you have some really horrific material that was produced in the context of terrorist activity, but is actually, being stored on YouTube as a way to document crimes, not to support them.
Billy, I wanted to ask you about how 230 interacts with online anonymity. You brought to my attention a recent Third Circuit decision and some elaboration on it, and wondering if you could maybe talk about how those things interact and what might be able to be done there.
So the Third Circuit came out with a decision recently, the Oberdorf decision, where it was a Section 230 issue because someone came up to Amazon, bought a, I believe it was like a dog walker, a dog leash. They were using it. I feel bad for the lady. The leash didn't work.
Through a third party.
Through a third party. This, yes,
Who
thank
was
you for.
selling on Amazon.com, but was not Amazon.com.
So she was using the leash. It broke and it hit her eye, and I believe it led to permanent blindness in one eye. She attempted to sue and wanted to sue the intermediary, but couldn't because Amazon didn't have any verified information about the seller or where they were located. So we were in the sort of twilight of Section 230 where they wanted to hold the person accountable who did the speech or did the conduct, but there wasn't any information for them to be able to act on it. So she sued Amazon instead. The Third Circuit basically said that Section 230 didn't apply, and instead the product liability of Pennsylvania applied. And crucially, one of the things that they noted here, and I don't believe it was dicta, was that one of the reasons why they were willing to let product liability apply here is because Amazon didn't take any sort of actions to get information about this seller so that someone could sue them if they engaged in some sort of product liability or bad faith. So Gus Hurwitz wrote about this case, and what I thought was really interesting about it was that it showed the court trying to figure out a way to incentivize companies to have this information so that individuals could act and make sure that people were held accountable. And that's always been sort of one of the main talking points that I've used about Section 230, right? That this is not about, that this is specifically about holding people who say the speech accountable for their speech. You can sue the person who defames you, right? You don't sue the platform or the website that hosts that speech, right? But what do you do when you can't sue that person, when they're anonymous? So Gus Hurwitz wrote about a proposal that he had after reading this case, where it basically said that he would like people to consider an analysis of the type of website, whether it's Amazon or Google or Facebook, and their ability to require people to give up their information to the company about where their address or their name, so that if there is a suit, they would be able to provide that information to allow someone to sue them. I mean, there are obvious privacy implications about that. I'm not sure I'm very comfortable with that. But one of the things that I appreciate about it was, at the very least, it was an attempt to deal with this very real concern when you're not able to have any sort of compensation or remedy when you've been wronged here. And if you'll allow me just to bug a little bit more about this, I think it's actually important that people deal with this, because there was a case that I read of an individual who was using Grindr, which is a gay dating app, and broke up with his boyfriend or whatever, and decided to use pictures of his boyfriend to create a profile and basically harass this individual. He would contact people and direct them to his ex-boyfriend's home at any time of day or any time of day as well. And this individual wanted some sort of way to prevent this from happening. And Grindr has Section 230 liability, right? So I'm not entirely sure what the best way to fix those sort of like anonymous sort of situations are. But I do hope that as we move forward on this, even if you're an individual like me who is very pro Section 230, I think we have to realize that there are consequences that come with that.
Jessica, I want to hand that one off to you. Obviously, there's a ton of anonymous speech on Reddit. I would say predominantly anonymous speech. How do you get liability to the actual speaker, and what would something like that do? And then I think we're going to open it up for questions relatively soon after your answer.
Yeah, I mean, you're really talking about, do people have a right to speak anonymously? And I think that in this country, the answer has to be unambiguously yes. It's extremely important, and we see this every day on our platform, which, as I mentioned before, is a more privacy-forward platform. We are what we call pseudonymous, so you're not fully anonymous like you might be on some sites. You do have a stable presence in terms of your account, but you go by your account name, not your real name. We don't demand that you tell us your real name. We don't even require an email address from you. And even your IP information, we wipe every 90 days. So we're really not interested in collecting all of your user data. And we don't want to be compelled to, frankly, because it will create enormous privacy issues. Because even if you go through the best practices, as soon as you have the data, it's subject to breach. And we don't need it. We don't want it. We don't need it. Don't make us keep it. But beyond that, as I said, having anonymous speech is really, really important because we see the value that it brings in terms of authenticity of conversations. We see conversations happening on Reddit that would never happen on a real name platform. We have lots of communities for new parents, for example, where people, they come on and they say, I'm having problems, connecting with my infant child. You would never go on Facebook and say that. You would post like beautiful photos of the kid and be like, everything's great, look at my awesome life. But people need spaces to be vulnerable and seek community with each other. We see, and then this applies internationally as well. I've been at Reddit for 2 years. Before that, my entire career was in Middle East security issues, and I spent a lot of time, many years, living in places like Abu Dhabi, places like Iraq. Where freedom of speech does not exist. And when you have experienced that, and you've experienced the power of a government to enforce against speech that it doesn't like, you recognize the seriousness of this. And again, we see that on our platform. I've seen posts of people who they come on and they are criticizing elements of their religious organization, which is punishable by death in some places. I've seen people come on and say, I'm a gay person in ISIS-controlled Syria. I'm having a real hard time. I'm thinking of killing myself. You need to allow that speech to exist. And if we have someone's name or address, then we'll get a foreign government request. And it'll be a legal request in terms of that country's law, and then we would potentially have to hand over that information. We don't want to be in that position. So I mean, this is a really, really serious issue, and I think that think that eliminating people's right to anonymous speech on the internet is going to solve what are tragic but thankfully generally rare situations. Is just it's a very blunt weapon to address a problem that probably needs a more strategic answer.
If I could just quickly add, the United States, another way the U.S. legal system is unique is that we have not an absolute, but a qualified right to anonymous speech under the First Amendment. It was recognized over the past 50 years by the Supreme Court in cases involving things like political pamphleteering, forcing the NAACP to disclose its membership lists, things like that. And courts have applied that, the lower courts have applied that to requests to unmask anonymous users. And there are, I think, 6 or 7 different balancing tests that they use to look at the strength of the claim, the privacy interests. So it's hard in the United States to subpoena something like an IP address or account information associated with an IP address. It's not impossible, but the U.S. does at least provide a limited amount or a decent amount of protection for that information.
Do we have questions?
Thank you, Rommella. Thank you, Steve Del Bianco. And absent 230, meaning if it were gone, I guess the only way these platforms of user content could insulate themselves from the risk of being sued for everything that we users do and say is they would give up all moderation whatsoever. By moderating nothing, they would enjoy the traditional conduit liability limitations. So I would ask each of the panelists if that is a world that you would favor, where platforms do zero moderation whatsoever of everything we users want to do and say. Thank you.
Brief answers.
No. No, I think what we've all seen is that the usability of basically every online service depends in part on some kind of moderation, whether it's just for spam or for adult content and pornography, all the way up through things like hate speech or taking down pictures of cats that are standing on 4 legs, not 2 legs. You know, content moderation helps shape the different spaces that we have online, and it often involves, you know, taking a pretty heavy hand against different types of speech.
I would say no also, but I think there has to be further examination of exactly what protections would remain. We really just don't know, because since 1996 there have been barely any cases having to look at those common law and First Amendment protections. It could be a end up defaulting to a notice-based system. So if a platform gets a notice of defamatory content, they would then have to take it down or stand in the shoes of the defendant. I think the Stratton Oakmont case, the Prodigy case, was a very poorly reasoned case, and it was by one New York State trial judge, so I don't necessarily know if that would become the law of the land, but it would be much, coming from the perspective of someone who, before I was in academia, advised websites on user content, I would say I would have been far more risk averse in what I would recommend.
No, and I think if we were in that world, users would revolt, and there would be changes afterwards. I think those who really want to change Section 230 in terms of just ending it entirely, I think haven't really thought through the full implications of what would happen.
Without providing any commentary to the underlying assumption, I will say no, I would not prefer to live in a world in which there was no content moderation and companies did not take responsibility for curating that content online.
No, I mean, obviously, well, it would make my job a lot easier. I'd be able to take some vacations. But aside from that, it's bad for business. You know, advertisers are not going to advertise on a site that's hosting a bunch of garbage.
Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Johnson. I'm with INTA. So yesterday I attended a Youth IGF meeting. It was the Day Zero event, and we had a discussion about this same issue. Can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, stand up. So we had a discussion of this issue, and we basically were talking about the issue of violence on the internet, especially. So we were looking at the issue of the Christchurch attack that happened a few months ago, and the fact that it was broadcast on the internet. And though there were only maybe 10 people watching it live stream, it kept being broadcast and recorded and sent continually afterwards. And so we were looking at the issue of what kind of solutions could platforms and law enforcement have for this. And we came to the conclusion, I think the similar conclusion that you have come to, is that maybe it's a matter of keeping the status quo. Maybe it's a matter of improving moderation, or we had thought maybe it would be best to improve some of the algorithms for taking down this content. So there was some discussion of having algorithms delay the tape of recording and take the content away until law enforcement would have the opportunity to take a look at it and see that this content is violent. Maybe there would be some sort of AI that would detect their gunshots in the background. But then there's of course the problem that this might take away legitimate content. So you might have a journalist that is covering this sort of activity. So where do you draw the line, and then who is responsible for taking down that content?
Brian, can you actually start with that one, because I think Christchurch really lies behind a lot of what you're talking about right now. And I think also the idea of what are our standard algorithms maybe plays into reasonable care as well. So if you could take that one.
Okay, so that's a lot between Ben and your question, sir. Well, I will start by saying that the Australian Parliament already made that decision on everyone's behalf. They passed a bill which attached criminal liability to basically every company operating in the digital economy if they do not respond, quote, expeditiously to take down, quote, I believe it's abhorrent violent content. The latter term is partially defined with examples, and the former is not defined. So that was their response. This is a very difficult question, and I don't think that I can give a solid answer on it, but I will tell just a brief story that I was told by someone just a few days ago who worked at a progenitor for one of the large social media networks that we have today. And he tells the story about how they actually came up with the idea of live streaming long before we had it today. This was probably about 10, 11 years ago. And when they took it to the legal team, and when the product team took it to the legal team, they said, look at what we can do. We can do live stream. Isn't this so great? We're gonna be developing a new product from our platform, and people are gonna use it, and it's gonna be fantastic. And one of the gentlemen in the room said, well, yes, but have you thought about how Congress is going to react if there's some sort of violent incident or some sort of, child pornography issue with this, And the lawyers said, well, we're shielded by Section 230. And this gentleman said, well, that's not going to matter when this video was played before a congressional committee. That's not a good answer for you, right? Because it doesn't give you any sort of guidelines as to what that means for a company that's actually, doing live stream. And I think the answer is that those lines are blurry. It's not clear how exactly you respond to something like that without simply not having the service at all, which is not to say that live stream shouldn't exist, but it is to say that we've seen how government reacts to a situation in which violent content is streamed live, and it's what we have in Australia now, which every single ISP, cloud hosting and storage provider, and consumer-facing digital platform company now has to comply with. Otherwise, criminal liability is attached. And it doesn't apply to content that is simply stored locally in Australia. It applies to content from anywhere in the world. So, there's no moral of the story here I can really give you. It's just to say that these are the issues that companies like ours and others have to actually deal with, even if we're not the ones who are creating these products and services.
Llansó, Tech Freedom. It's difficult to understand how radical IBM's proposal is without really understanding how 230 works. The key distinction is it's not just an immunity from liability, it's an immunity from suit. It sets a very high bar for someone to come into court and show why the company should lose that protection. What IBM is proposing is that goes out the window. And then all of a sudden, every company has to then defend themselves and show that what they did is reasonable. That is a complete transformation of how 230 works. It's not a moderate change. It's not a small revision. It's a dramatic change. And if you want to think about how that would work, you could look at the example of SESTA, because we had a lot of this debate then. And someone at the time said that SESTA would open the door to immense uncertainty while closing off opportunities for budding innovators. New startups looking to engage the internet community are less likely to acquire funding for their ventures if content that their user generates would result in multiple bankruptable civil suits. Venture capitalists abhor uncertainty, and the potentially broad interpretation of this law's changes to liability statutes could very quickly result in an evaporated pool of available capital. Ryan, that was you writing that sex trafficking bill, SESTA, would make the internet a wasteland 2 years ago before you joined IBM. So I find it pretty remarkable that the only person who had the courage to come up on this panel and defend this idea and claimed it was a moderate one is a person who 2 years ago recognized that these changes to 230 would be devastating, especially for smaller organizations and companies like Reddit. So no, I don't really believe that IBM is operating in good faith here. I think it's very easy for a company like IBM to get up and say these things when, frankly, your business model doesn't depend on making user-generated content available to other users. So I'd love to hear what the panel thinks about A, what's really driving these proposals, and whether this is actually in good faith, or whether this is, just like Senator Hawley's proposal, being driven by cynical and craven political calculations. And B, how, if in fact the key to Section 230 is that it operates today as an immunity from suit, from having to defend against the death by 10,000 duck bites that Judge Kaczynski warned about in the roommates.com decision. If that's what makes 230 work today, how do we try to address the concerns that have been raised about moderate proposals and the need to give some recognition to valid plaintiffs, or in fact, does the law already draw the right balance?
That's a lot of questions. I don't know if you guys know Barrett, but whenever you call on him.
Emma, you want to take this?
reputation has been questioned here, please.
It is, yes, and I think I'll just limit my response to that and that alone, quite frankly. I did write an op-ed, yes, about 2 years ago in which I criticized Sesta Fosta at the time. Like many others in the right-of-center think tank world where I was at the time, we felt like this was going to be the end of the internet. And of course, the internet has not been destroyed. I guess my response to the audience is I would very strongly urge you to look at not just this single, the one single only op-ed, only piece of public content I ever wrote on this issue, on Section 230 in general, frankly. And I would urge you to look at the pieces I wrote both before and after this. A few months after this, I came out in support of the Honest Ads Act, precisely because I said that the current status quo online was not tenable anymore. 6 months prior to actually publishing that piece in The Hill, I made it very clear that the internet's laissez-faire days were probably coming to an end. In fact, the title of that piece was Twilight on the Electronic Frontier. Now, from a personal standpoint, I'd also like to urge us to focus on the ideas. Maybe you disagree with the proposal that IBM is forwarding, and it's perfectly reasonable for you to disagree with us. But I think we need to be focused on actually debating ideas and not debating some of the hidden, supposedly, motivations behind why it is we're making these proposals, right? There are an awful lot of articles all the time about funding for this organization or funding for that organization and what are their real motivations. You know, IBM's position on this is we want to engage with the ideas, and we want to engage with the serious individuals out there who want to engage with us on these ideas. I don't really know what else to say. I changed my mind on this debate, but I never really had these feelings very strongly to begin with, at least not starting in 2017. I started to see the way things were going, and frankly, I did what I think an intellectually honest person does. I changed my mind. And I'll leave it at that.
One last question?
Hey, Tim Ryder, I'm just an American citizen who's no longer believes in the left-right political spectrum at all. So basically, I'm someone, I grew up in the 90s, and with that technological mix, I'm someone who was very happy with, the balance we had reached on free expression, and, what you're allowed to say on late-night TV was a little bit different, and but we've re-engineered the world, and that world no longer exists. So the laws from that time, to me, no longer make any sense. And I think actually philosophically, I'm very much in line with, sorry I forgot your name, but from Reddit. But when I actually look at pragmatically what we're dealing with, the speed, the scale, the geographical scope, that's when I'm just humbled and I break down. I'm just like, I don't know how to enforce existing law. So I guess to me the question, it seems like in our public debate, we're relitigating the outer limits of free expression on US territory, but we're also struggling with how do we even enforce existing law? And to me, I would like to separate those two conversations, at least philosophically, so everyone who agreed that the laws we have were basically good, how do we now enforce them with this new technological mix versus relitigating things? I don't know, is that the wrong way to think about it? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I just want to talk about the enforcement issue of this. I mean, as we noted about Backpage, there are laws on the books if people are engaging in illegal conduct on the internet. I mean, what should happen? I think the answer is if you are in West Virginia and you are concerned about websites that are selling opioids to West Virginians, right? You should be calling the U.S. Attorney of West Virginia and say, hey, why aren't you suing these companies for selling drugs into our state? I mean, they can do that. I think that's the better way to deal with this than to try to tinker with the very delicate balance that we have in regards to free speech and free expression on the internet.
And I think you really raise a good point that gets raised a lot about, well, Section 230 was passed in 1996, different technology. We have a lot of really old laws on the books. We have we have the Bill of Rights, which is pretty old. And so I think that just saying, and one good thing about Section 230 is it's fairly technologically agnostic. It's not saying these specific types. The definition of interactive computer services is very broad, and it could be it could be adapted to sort of the current norms. We have other laws that are technologically specific. We have something called the Video Privacy Protection Act that applies to videotape service providers and that's been a mess. It had to be, and so I think that Section 230, just because it's more than 2 decades old, that's not a reason to say, let's not have it on the books anymore. There are legitimate criticisms of it, but the age of the law, I think, is not one of them.
And a little bit to Baron's question about like what are the motivations behind all of these debates, I do think there are some genuine motivations of concern by people, right, of not understanding their information environment today, not understanding how all of these different forces are operating. And we've talked a lot, and I've talked a lot about how important Section 230 is as the legal framework, but I still think there's a lot more that companies can do to provide more transparency, be more accountable to their users for how they do content moderation, and that's a key piece of all of this. Thought of it when we were talking about the response to the Christchurch shooting video. One thing that we've called on the major platforms to do is release more information about how they responded, in the minutes, hours, and days after the attack. They've done some public commentary, which is positive. It helps us understand kind of the nature of it. But at this point, it's other than maybe Jessica from Reddit, like none of us in this room can really make a call on whether they did a good job or not, partly because we don't have information, but also partly because this is a really difficult thing to do, and people working at the companies right now are kind of the leading experts in it. So for this conversation to really move forward and go anywhere about what we expect from companies, whether it's in a legal framework or in self-regulatory initiatives, we need more information about how do you respond to a Christchurch sort of situation. What were the strengths of the response? What were the weaknesses, the limitations? What can companies do to improve the response? Asterisk, do we all agree on what we think the response should be? So I think there's a lot of room for more discussion, as I think everybody on the panel has said we should have, but a key thing that we need is more information from the companies about the actual kind of facts behind how all of this works.
And I'll just throw in here quickly on the transparency side, we totally agree. Transparency in this regard is really, really important. Every year we publish a transparency report about takedowns on the platform. It used to only be about legal takedowns. So when we would get requests from governments to remove content and also copyright takedown requests that we got. This year, for the first time, we expanded it to include data on policy takedowns. So those are takedowns that we do in terms of our own policies, because we thought that data is really important to show to the users. And it's important for us to track it too, because we want to be able to keep track of this and see how we're doing. And then we also track in that transparency report how many of these takedown decisions are being made by moderators, right, with nothing to do with us for any reason at all, for subreddit rules. And newsflash, as I said before, it's actually more than 99% of all policy takedowns on Reddit are done by our users, because that's how our model operates. But yeah, you can go on that. You can look at our transparency report right now, redditinc.com/policies, and pull it down from the menu. It's really, really interesting, and I highly recommend that you all do so. And all of the major platforms tend to publish these types of reports. And so you can see kind of differences in moderation and who's heavy-handed, who's kind of more laissez-faire in the comparisons.
So I'm going to ask for some closing thoughts, and I'm just going to start with you, Jessica, and come back this way. Where are we going to be on this debate in a year? We're a year out from Fosta Sesto. Where are we going to be on this debate in another year? And everybody has about 30 to 40 seconds.
Yeah, I hope that actually a year from now, so it'll be right before the election. So actually I was going to say, I think, yeah. So I think, I hope that after the election, things will be in a more rational place, because I think right now that there's a lot of heavy breathing on 230 because it gets a response from constituencies, whether you're on the left or the right, but it's not really grounded in a place of understanding of the practical aspects of what the law actually does and how it enables competition, how it enables different models in the marketplace. So yeah, I would like to see more panels like this, because this is one of the better ones that I've been on. Thank you to my colleagues up here, and thank you for the excellent questions. And I'd like to see just a more educated, elevated debate on 230.
I'm mostly just going to say ditto to what Jessica said. I would just throw on top of that that we'd like to see a little bit more of, and also an understanding of the practical political realities on the ground, and starting to get people coming together and talking about what makes sense looking forward on 230.
I'm usually an optimist. I think, unfortunately, that this sort of the narrative about 230 on the left and the right has metastasized a little bit, unfortunately. I would hope that there will be more education so that people would be able to view the actual real problems that people can actually debate about 230 and the real benefits of those. That would be my hope. The reality is I think we're going to see the same people that we've seen on both sides stand with their viewpoints that there isn't enough moderation or that there's too much bias, and keep using those talking points because they believe it's politically beneficial to them.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said, particularly the need to have a better debate and more education of how Section 230 operates. I would just also add that in light of these two very different criticisms of Section 230, and again, I'm not a political expert, I have no idea, but I don't see any solution that would satisfy both sides of the critics. And perhaps that doesn't matter, I don't know, but I just don't see a solution that people would be happy with.
And I think we here in the US are going to have an even hopefully better understanding of how much the debates outside the US are really affecting our access to the internet and our abilities to speak online. We'll see the implementation of a number of different regulations in Europe, including the Copyright Directive, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, Platform to Business Regulation, the impact of laws like the Australian abhorrent video law, and whatever comes out of the Christchurch call, which was a kind of a New Zealand government-led effort to get major tech companies, mostly the big US players and governments around the world, to agree to take more aggressive action against terrorist content online. What exactly that means is being debated right now. It's being kind of worked out in different private and public settings. There's a lot more information, happy to provide after the panel, but lots of decisions are already being made about what responsibilities platform companies will have, and I think we'll have a much better sense of what that means for us here in the US.